Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Hero's Mindset podcast. I am Nick Lugo, the host, and I just finished my conversation with Emerald Wilkins about 5 minutes ago, and I'm going to say blown away. I am blown away. That was maybe the most enlightening conversation that I've ever had, and I say that with a good amount of truth to my knowledge, and I mean, it goes back to her background. You know, she's very, very interested in the works of Carl Jung. You know, that is really what gave her hero's moment, her enlightening moment. And in this podcast, we talk so much about, going deeper into yourself and really figuring out who you are. The only thing that I recommend is, as you're listening to this podcast, figure out how it applies to yourself. Don't just look at it as, something that is enlightening for someone else, some good life lessons that you could really apply. It's like try to see how it applies to yourself, because we spend so much time trying to break it down. This episode starts in the middle. So we just sort of let the conversation flow. So we're just going to go to where she got started. And the further you go into the conversation, the deeper it gets. So, enjoy.
The way that I came about finding that was actually, I happened to be, so when I was 20, and I had some awakening experiences, and I didn't really know how to, reconcile that with my present state of okay, how do I actually reconcile things that seem fundamentally at odds with basically going about my life and establishing myself as a young adult. So when I was 20, again, had these experiences. Afterward, it was I was trying to kind of write over reality, and it was just a big mess. And so what ended up happening is I found a blog by someone named Jean Raffa. And she works under the Jungian framework. And so I really immersed myself in her work. And then she had a bunch of bibliographies in the back of her books. And it was all the things, all the people that she would read. And so I read basically a bunch of people working under the Jungian framework from the angle of kind of integration of the feminine, which is a huge sort of sticking point for me. It's something I recognized during those awakening experiences, that there was a big repression there. And I read a few things from Jung himself, but most of my awareness of Jung's model has come from basically people working under that model and kind of digging deeper into it. But I do find Jung's work very interesting as well. But I was really into that for, let's say, probably about a year and a couple of months, just really digging into and immersing myself in the reading of it. And what I found once I got to a certain point, it was almost I felt like I was maybe almost avoiding the work by immersing myself so much in the external of it.
What do you mean by that?
So immersing myself in the learning of the process. It's almost I got to a certain point with it, but then it was oh, now it's time to deal with other things that are going on internally. And so after that, I found a couple of other teachers that really resonated with me. And then basically, once about 4 years ago or so, it just was I just don't want to take in any other information. It's I need to go internal to myself. And so basically what's been happening is mostly a lot of my work has been just very internal, very, very much about contemplating on here are these issues that I'm going through, and how do I kind of dig into that. And so sometimes I have found learning things externally has been helpful, but I also know that there's a way that I can distract myself from going inside if I'm very focused toward the external. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little confused on what you mean by external. I mean, so when you say external, do you mean reading Jung, right? Is that one of those things where, Jung he'll say something about, this might happen in this general case, but then you don't take it and say, wait a second, how does this apply to me? Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's what I found myself doing is when I first started reading the works of Jungian authors, it was oh my goodness. And so much stuff was falling into place. Before it was just it was almost my psyche was just in a state of rubble, and I was down in so many rabbit holes. And then I read a lot of Jungian authors, and it was oh, this just clears up so much of that. And then I got to a certain point where everything got kind of in place in the more intellectual sort of framework sense of things. And then it was a little bit I guess the way I would categorize it, let's say that you're trying to do some yard work and you're trying to set it up so that a garden can grow there. And then you do all of the work to like get all the rows set up, and you make sure that everything's set up the right way, everything's organized, all the debris and the junk is out of the yard. And then it's like, then it's time to plant the garden. And then you want to continue organizing that yard, and you're like, micromanaging it. And you're like, okay, well, hang on, let's make sure that this is like just in the right position. I felt like I started to do that. Like I felt like I was, okay, I'm doing like, I'm trying to set myself up for this other process, but I find myself so immersed in the setting myself up for that process that I'm using it to avoid the process. So that's basically the way that it was. And that was probably back when I was about 23, I think. And by the time I hit like 24, I was like, okay, hang on a second. I'm now using this to avoid what I need to look at.
You hit a good archetype there. Have you ever read Thus Spake Zarathustra?
I have, actually.
So the most profound thing that he had in there was the idea of the three metamorphoses. Do you know what those are or no?
Let me try to.
It's like a page or two. It's really small.
Was it when he says like, okay, so there's three phases of sacrifice. So first, there's like, with religion, there's the sacrifice. No, a different thing.
No, different thing. So that's the thing about Thus Spake Zarathustra. Thus Spake Zarathustra is literally, it's like 1 page or 2 pages of like infinite wisdom of stories inside of them. That's why I like it so much. It's like every time I read it, I only read one of those pages, but it's like it's like so wise. But anyway, so his idea of the three metamorphoses are it says there are 3 stages of human transformation, or 3 stages of the human life, and you go from a camel to a lion to a to a child, and it's great. He says, so for the first stage of your life, or for the first stage of any hero's journey, for the first stage of any, growing process, you start off as a camel, and the camel gets on his knees and says to everybody, he says, put a load on me, right? Put something on my back, and put something on my back so I can carry it, right? That's the purpose of a camel. And then the purpose of the camel is eventually to take all that wisdom, right, which we could see in terms of like human wisdom as in books, right, experiences, learning, obedience, right, all of these things. And then you take that, and the camel has to walk into the woods and turn into a lion. And then when they turn into a lion, they need to fight this dragon, right? And the dragon himself is made of gold, right? So they're in this forest. The lion, which was once a camel, and obviously there's a little, the better camel you were, the better lion you become. And when you go and fight this dragon, the dragon is the symbolism for the established system, right? The established system of, here are all the things that I've heard, and well, are they right? I don't know if they're right. You can think of that in terms of religion, right? Like, okay, I follow this great religion, and it's given me this great structure, aka one of the things that I learned as a camel, but also it's a little bit tyrannical, or it doesn't fit me here, and I really don't like it. And that's why the dragon is a golden dragon. And it says on every single scale of the dragon, it says, thou shall, because you're essentially fighting against the rules of your system. And then if you're successful, the lion beats the dragon, right? And you've broken away from the system that you were once in, but you still have the fundamental camel inside of you. And then by the end of it, you become a child. And the reason why you become a child is because now that you've broken away from the system, you're able to, first of all, be imaginative, which a child is, and also be free, right? Be able to break away and come up with every idea from a blank slate, because, well, the system that you were in before was slightly tyrannical. So it sounds like in your case, that you were a camel who, instead of walking into the woods and confronting himself, right, or confronting the dragon, you were just sort of like walking around, kind of waiting until.
Absolutely, yeah. Lots of like, I was taking on more and more and more stuff, and then eventually I came to the point where I was like, wait a second, this was working before, but it's not working now. And I know that at the time, like, I wasn't very aware of the nature of the path in that sense. And so I was like, oh, wait, did I just like throw away a year, like immersing myself in this? And I was like, wait a second, like, why is this not working? And so I just didn't realize it was like a different phase in the journey. And, basically when it comes to, let's say, the camel, like thinking about that in regard to, let's say, indoctrination, these are things that, we we basically learn, what our culture teaches us and what our family teaches us. And once we start to, let's say, question those things, we can kind of lighten our load. And, I remember as a teenager, like I wasn't into spirituality in any sense then, but I was always wondering, okay, what's underneath social constructs? So it's a big deal, like what's underneath social constructs? So there's always that questioning, but never quite getting the answer to that. And it really has been like having to transform into the lion to kind of bust through certain, let's say, cherished worldviews, things that, maybe I take for granted because they're comforting, or maybe I just take for granted to be able to feel a sense of groundedness, or, things that I just never bothered to question. And so I really feel for myself that I'm probably right in that lion's phase of trying to slay the dragon in some ways. And, really trying to, and it can be very sticky in this way, trying to, let's say, from the standpoint of my current paradigm, like sort of cut the floor out from under myself, which is fundamentally what you're doing whenever you're fighting that dragon. So it's sort of like all of the things that you take as your baseline assumptions about reality. What you have to do is you have to examine those and pick those apart, while also in many ways being immersed in those things. So that's really the tricky part about that second phase there.
Okay. So I'm going to try to break that down, because that was very confusing, but I think I got it, right? So what you're saying is, when you're a camel, right, when you're learning all these things, even though there might be something wrong with it, there might be some tyrannical aspect of it, it's giving you structure, right? It's giving you comfort, right? By, let's say, for example, if you go into the Christian religion, right, you accept religion, right? Or even with parents, right? Like you accept the security of parents, but at the same time, it's like there's some tyrannical aspect of it, but they're giving you stability, they're giving you structure, they're giving you all these amazing things that, well, if you were to fight the dragon, if you are to essentially remove part of that. So for example, if we're talking about Jung says, hey, listen, I like the Christian religion. There are a lot of good things about it, but they have some things that are fundamentally wrong. And by doing that, he's saying, hey, listen, the Christian religion isn't perfect, right? And therefore he wasn't a Christian. And by doing that, you literally sort of denounce the Christian religion and you lose the stability of the Christian religion, right? And you're right. That's a little scary. What?
Absolutely.
That's the story of the Lion King. Actually, that's actually the story of the Lion King. It's
We talked about the Lion King yesterday. So let's say I want to know how you're tracking the Lion King onto that in particular. Like from what angle specifically?
Well, so actually, I on my YouTube channel, I've done so far 2 full lectures on the Lion King and tried to analyze the whole thing. And I'm on the 3rd one. It's actually going to get posted hopefully in 2 days. So it's actually pretty good. But so my analysis is, you look at someone like, so Simba's born in Pride Rock, right? And we could think of Pride Rock as the perfect village, right? And it's also the symbol for Simba, right? So he's born and he's got the good father. He's got the good King Mufasa, who's kind of there. And Mufasa gives him security, right? But there's a scene where Mufasa and Simba are standing on the top of Pride Rock. And Mufasa says to Simba, everything that the light touches, that is your kingdom, and you will be the king. And then Simba says, but what about that? And that's the place where the light didn't touch. That was Scar's kingdom. And Mufasa says, you don't go there, right? That's not the place to go. And if we're looking at that from a Jung perspective, from a psychological perspective, it's essentially saying, here's all the good things that I have given you, right? But there's this one tyrannical aspect of my teachings, right? Or there's this one there's this one place in your brain where you should repress, right? And don't go there, right? So then you go along and Mufasa dies, right? So then Simba becomes we'll call him a literal lion as he's going to defeat the dragon, which we won't say the dragon. We'll say maybe the dragon. Yeah. So the dragon in this case is going to be Scar, right? Because Scar is part of the shadows. He's part of that kingdom where Simba said, what's that, right? And when Simba defeats Scar, it's the perfect representation of he has made conscious the things that Mufasa has not made conscious. He has beaten the things that Mufasa was wrong about and overcome them.
Gotcha. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah. So basically with that, it's kind of a little bit like Simba has to kind of face with the shadow, because ultimately what we
Yeah.
have is we have, let's say, the king of consciousness, which is Mufasa, and we have the king of the shadow, which is Scar. And let's say having to essentially kind of face directly with the king of the shadow, he starts to, let's say, maybe in some ways start to integrate his own shadow side and having to face with the own dark side of his nature and this kind of thing. Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, I never thought about the Lion King through that particular lens. But I suppose when it comes to, let's say, fighting the dragon in general and like having to kind of essentially like pull apart the structure of our, let's say, most deeply ingrained beliefs. So you brought up religion. Religion's like a good example of this, because it sort of acts as its own microcosm of beliefs. And we can kind of, especially in religions that we don't specifically subscribe to, we can look from the outside and we can really see that there's this whole structure of like religious and cultural beliefs all in one that, basically you can kind of imagine from the outside what that's like to have those, let's say, a priori assumptions about reality.
Wait,
And
define a priori for everybody else.
yeah, so it's just sort of like assuming that that's basically like what the status quo is. These are just
Yeah.
the baseline assumptions. So
And it's also without experience, right? So like making an assumption with something, making the assumption, oh, Buddhism is terrible without even experiencing Buddhism.
Exactly.
It's like an ivory tower idea. Yeah.
Most definitely. Yeah. So if there's this assumption about the way that reality is and a whole belief structure around it, which is fundamentally what a religious worldview is, or even other worldviews as well. But if we look at religion, we can go like, oh, we can see that this person is really standing atop this scaffolding, and so there's a lot of aspects of their personality that relate directly to that scaffolding. So their ego is going to be tied into it, their identity. There's going to be a lot of like personal and emotional associations with that worldview. And in people that I've talked to who have, let's say, been excommunicated from a religion, or who have, let's say, just kind of fallen out of, let's say, like sort of lost their faith and this kind of thing, oftentimes it's described like almost like the bottom is falling out of reality, and so just imagining that, let's say, within the microcosm of a religious structure, and then extrapolating that out and recognizing that each and every single one of us has a religion, even if we don't recognize it. These are our baseline assumptions about how reality works, our baseline assumptions about who we are, who we're not, all these different things kind of count as our own religion, even if they're not collectively believed in. And so often,
First of all, explain how deep that is. Like, explain when we say that we have a religion, like, don't think that it's like the backdrop of everything. It's sort of like in the corner and we don't really focus on it. It is the thing that runs our lives. Explain how that's actually true.
Yeah. So if you can imagine, basically, in order to derive meaning from reality, we have to essentially project meaning onto it. And there's so much that we can't possibly know that our mind kind of fills in the blanks, or our parents fill in the blanks with this, baseline indoctrination about things, or, and it can come from any perspective. Even something that we think of as very non-religious and secular, like science, could be made as part of your religion. It's your baseline assumptions about how reality works, about who you are. And basically, we're so deeply ingrained with it that it becomes even part of our ego structure. And so such a deep connection to the way that we believe the world to be, because this is how we fundamentally get a sense of, where our up and down is. It's how we derive context, that we often don't realize that the very ground that we're standing on is something that our mind creates to make sense of things. And that's what I meant by, like, in the same way that you can look at the microcosm of someone's personal religion from the outside, if you don't belong to the same religion, and you can go, oh, this person is assuming this thing, or this person has that view. We all have that, and so part of actually becoming the lion and slaying the dragon comes to be about recognizing, taking the things, even the most basic things that we would take for granted about reality, are in a sense like that religion. There are scaffolding, there are mental framework around how things work, that even if they hold some kind of truth in the external. Just the fact that it is a framework that our mind creates, it fundamentally functions as that scaffolding. And so whenever you're going into the lion phase, a lot of it is about kind of almost like cutting the floor out from under yourself in that way, because you're so much on that platform that once you start questioning these things, it can be kind of like a little bit like Wile E. Coyote, like out on the branch of the tree. He's like cutting the branch out from under him while not realizing that he's doing that. And so it can create a kind of instability in that lion phase, especially if we, let's say, have just a general belief that things work this particular way, and our identity, our ego, is based in reality working that way. And then losing that belief about reality or questioning that belief about reality can be very threatening to the ego. And so we can have a tendency to hold on to that.
That's such an interesting perspective, because I've noticed this in my own life, so I go to Indiana University, and in Indiana University, I'm in the business school. The thing about business schools nowadays is, everybody wants a secure job, right? The main goal of the business school is to go into finance or accounting, which are known as the most secure jobs, most high paying jobs. And the key for everything is stability, right? So when we're talking about something like this, first of all, we got to say that these are probably things that are indoctrinated by parents. And when we say indoctrination, we don't mean it as something that's good or bad. It can be good, it can be bad, right? So one of the things that my parents will say indoctrinate on me, and it's something that's very widely spread, is that you need to have a secure job, you need to be stable, you need to be good with your finances. And I've noticed that in my own life that first of all, I've not chosen that route. I've said, hey, listen, I've already fought my dragon and said, hey, listen, stability is not my thing, because while stability is nice, I'd rather I guess not go for the thing that is super stable, because I guess my belief is that maybe it will kill my soul, right? My belief is something that is super stable just will absolutely, it will be too comfortable, right? And I believe that too many people struggle with this idea of, all right, I want to go into accounting, I want to go into finance, and I am going to work my ass off. I'm going to do the thing. I'm going to ditch my dreams. That's probably the reason why I don't want to do it. It's because I have to ditch my dreams to be an accountant, and so all these kids, they say, hey, listen, I want to go into finance, I want to go into accounting, I want to ditch my dreams for the stability. The problem with that is that they're still a camel, right? They're still a camel, and they haven't confronted their shadow, they haven't confronted the dragon, they haven't become a lion. None of that has happened. And the biggest problem with that is because their religion, right? Their main thing that has been organizing their entire life has been stability. And ironically, if they were to, let's say, ditch this idea of stability, right? Ditch this idea of, okay, I need to be an accountant, I need to be finance, I need to get good finances, they'd also experience even more instability, because the floor would fall out from under them, right? So this religion of hey, listen, I want stability, right? This thing that they've learned also is sort of like a double aspect in the fact that they will have instability in their own personal selves as well as their outer selves. And I find that is such a scary, scary thing. But I think that's something that really hurts most people, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And now, so one thing I wanted to parse out the distinction of is that, okay, there are survival concerns. So basically, beyond our frameworks around things, we have our survival needs. And basically what happens is that on that level, we do have to find a way to survive. But what happens there is that there's a belief that this is the way that I can survive the very best. This is the way that I can get to that safety and stability, which is not necessarily the case. There's plenty of different routes people can go. And then there's also the element of, what will my parents think if I don't go into this, or what will the neighbors think, or what will that, And so what happens is that we end up being negatively motivated instead of positively motivated toward what it is that we want to do. And so basically there are two types of motivation. There's positive and negative motivation. Positive motivation and negative motivation both are always about the emotion that you're either seeking to go toward or seeking to get away from. So it's all emotional based. So whenever you're, let's say, positively motivated towards something, you're going towards something because you think that it will give you an emotion that you want to experience. Whenever you're negatively motivated towards something, you're trying to get away from that thing so that you don't have to experience a particular emotion that you don't want to experience.
Which is survival in this case. Yeah.
Absolutely. So what oftentimes happens is because people don't recognize that they're emotionally motivated toward their goals, is that they'll tend to pick things that will lead them sort of into a corner, because they're more like they're trying to unconsciously avoid certain feelings, like, oh, they want to avoid the feeling of instability, or they want to avoid the feeling of being judged, or they want to avoid the feeling of ostracism, or whatever feeling it is that they want to avoid. And what that does is that translates into, oh, I want to go into a career in finance. Now, someone could very well actually really want to go into a career in finance, but let's say a person, like, because they're negatively motivated by, let's say instability, or negatively, sorry, hang on, let me get rid of this pop-up came up. Yeah, so they're negatively motivated by, let's say, insecurity, or, negatively motivated by instability, not wanting to experience those emotions. They kind of create a way to get away from that. And the vehicle that they use is one that doesn't lead them in the direction they actually do want to go in. So they become so focused because of what's called negativity bias, where we over-focus on the negative stimuli, the negative emotions we don't want to experience, without focusing on the emotions that we do want to experience and building our life around what we do want. So I think, like, if I were to be giving somebody advice who was, like, let's say in the transition point between, going from teenager to adult, and just setting down those roots, the best thing a person can really do is get in touch with what are their favorite emotions? What emotions do they actually experience? And how can you create a vehicle for moving in that particular direction with your career, with your lifestyle, and otherwise? So thinking about the things that we typically think of as the goal is more like the vehicle toward the goal. The destination is actually the emotional experience, whether we're conscious of it or not.
That's interesting. I never thought of it from that perspective. Whenever someone says, I strive for financial security, I never thought of it. So that's when they phrase it in that way. They're saying, hey, listen, I'm striving for something that will bring me a positive reward, right? But there's another way of looking at it. There's a way of looking at it is, it's not I strive for financial security. It's I fear financial insecurity.
Absolutely.
Right. And you got to ask the question. It's like, which one is motivating them more? It's the same idea of you should love God, but you should also fear God. Right. That's a strong idea in the Christian religion. And well, how do you parse that out? I think that's a better question. It's like, how do you sit there and say, I fear financial instability more than I want financial stability?
Absolutely. So basically, let's say that I wanted, so let's take an example. So let's say that I think I want $1 million, and I can say, okay, well, why is it that I want $1 million? Is it because, I want to experience the excitement of having $1 million, or, maybe I'm going to feel a sense of accomplishment in having $1 million, or some other positive emotion, or like, I can do a lot of traveling and it's going to feel like this a big adventure because I have $1 million. Or is it, oh God, I really want $1 million because I just don't know how I'm going to pay my rent, and I just want a relief from all of the stress and everything. And so really being able, with any given vehicle that we've chosen to meet an emotional goal, which is every motivation we ever had, we can always ask ourselves, what am I actually motivated toward? Is it because I want the $1 million because of the positive emotions that it's going to bring me, or I want the $1 million to bring myself up out of certain fears or certain insecurities? And then from there, we can recognize, okay, well, if there's these fears and insecurities, what's the reason behind those? And oftentimes, they don't necessarily have to do with actual survival concerns. They're more like projected survival concerns. So describe a little bit more about negativity bias. So that means basically, and it's something that we have and animals have as well. It's basically saying that we are going to prioritize negative stimuli over positive stimuli as a survival mechanism. So let's say that
it's always 2x. Yeah. I mean, it's always like they did a study. It was like, if you pick up $20 in the street, you're going to get a level 5 of happiness. And then if you lose if you lose $10, then you're going to get a level 5 of unhappiness. Right. So it's Yeah. So it's 2x of the negativity, even though it's the same exact phenomenon. It's the same exact
Absolutely.
thing.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So I'd never thought about that in terms of like the actual ratio. But let's say that I'm a fish, right? And so I'm motivated again, like by mostly negativity bias. And then like I also have my positive drives. And I go and I see my ideal food source, whatever that happens to be, plankton or whatever. And I'm like, oh, there's some great plankton. And then over there, I see a shark swimming around. I'm going to go like, hang on a second. I'm just going to leave the plankton there. There's a shark swimming. I'm going to go elsewhere. And this works perfectly fine for most creatures in the animal kingdom, because most creatures in the animal kingdom can't project their own sharks onto situations, because that's sort of more of a human thing. So a fish experiences, let's say a shark, and then a few minutes later, the shark's completely out of their mind. Like they're not ruminating on the shark. They're not projecting sharks everywhere. Whereas we as human beings have the capacity for, let's say, intellectual projection. We can create things in our mind. We have very vivid memories, and we can project sharks everywhere we go. And so what oftentimes happens to people who end up, let's say, being motivated more by fear is that they're projecting either past situations that have happened that are no longer happening onto the situation, like, oh, let me avoid that. Or they're projecting certain beliefs and stories that they've heard that they wouldn't want to have happen to them onto the current situation.
Can you give an example?
So let's say that, let me take it back to the financial example. Let's say that somebody's parents had always told them that, oh, this is the way that you have to survive. You have to become an accountant. If you don't, there's going to be no job security and you're going to be a beggar on the street. So they basically have the idea of, I'm going to be a beggar on the street in their mind.
That's the shark.
Absolutely. And so if anything else comes up, like, oh, I think I want to be an artist, or, oh, I think I want to start my own business, or, oh, I think I want to do whatever, other way they can get money.
And that's the plankton.
Yeah, absolutely. Then they imagine, oh no, I'm going to be the beggar on the street. And what happens is that then they go, nah, I'd rather not risk being a beggar on the street. I'm going to go and I'm just going to do a safe job in finance, as opposed to taking that leap of faith and saying, what do I really want? And what happens is that we then start living our lives based on the emotions we don't want to experience and avoiding the emotions we don't want to experience, as opposed to organizing our lives in such a way where we're orienting it specifically to give us let's say the best feelings, our favorite emotions, the best feelings, the things that we actually want to be experiencing. And so what happens is we end up, when we are, let's say, building our life around avoidance, it's like we end up just usually either ending up in bad situations because of that, or just kind of not really living, not really launching ourselves. So I would say that a lot of people end up, because of fear, becoming sort of stuck in jobs that they dislike. I have a friend of mine who refers to like getting stuck in a good job as being like, golden handcuffs. It's like, it's well paying, and it's like, there's a reward to that, and there's a stability that comes from that, but it's like otherwise soul sucking if they don't really enjoy that job.
So let me ask you a question. I would like to frame the idea in another debate, or in another way. I would want to ask the question from a Jungian perspective, from a psychological perspective. Why is therefore financial stability, like the idea of financial stability in the way that you said golden handcuffs? Why are the golden handcuffs? Why are they the shark?
Gotcha. So it's not so much that the golden handcuffs themselves are the shark. If they were the shark, we'd be avoiding them. They are very much the shark in some way. They're the shark that sneaks up on us when we're not looking. It's a little bit like how a frog crawls into a pot of cold water and then you slowly turn up the temperature.
Yeah.
The frog doesn't realize it's boiling. So ironically, the golden handcuffs are actually more dangerous than the shark. But the problem is human beings don't project the shark onto that. They project the shark onto the unknown, onto the blank projection screen of the unlived future. So if it's like, okay, I can either go into a safe job in finance, or I can follow my dream of being an artist or something like that. And so they project the shark onto the dream of being an artist because there's uncertainty there. And they say, okay, well, I have a certainty about the way that this finance job will go. And then they get in the pot of the cold water and they're like, okay, well, this is fine. And then turned up slowly, slowly, slowly. And they get so used to it that becomes homeostasis. That becomes the status quo. It becomes the demons that you know. And then there's like the whole, like, oh, I don't want to, so I'll stick to the demons I know. So I don't face.
Yeah.
I don't.
Better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. I like that. I mean, I love that idea. The fact that it's golden handcuffs, like it's golden, but it's handcuffs, right? So like you could look at it from literally two perspectives. You could look at it from the person who, oh yes, you get the gold, but you get the handcuffs. It's the same idea as the Midas touch, So I got to ask the question, for the person who, we'll say, takes a stable job, right? And I've been trying to explain this. I've been trying to figure out how to explain this. Maybe you could help me. Trying to explain, how does it kill your soul? In the idea of like, we talk about heroes, the book I read is about the hero's journey, and I say, there's the idea of the hero, and the hero is somebody who succeeds, right? Mm-hmm. But what about the person who just decides not to be the hero, the person who rejects their hero's journey? What? Right? That would be the person who chooses the financial stability instead of being the artist, right? So the question is, over the span of 50 years, what effect does that have on their soul?
Gotcha. So we all have different aspects inside of ourselves, right? So we have essentially what is a core person, like a core personality. So this is how we are in our most natural kind of essence. And then, of course, as we go through life, we, start to express that through different lenses that are, we are basically indoctrinated into and that kind of thing. And that's fine. We also need to be able to, let's say, have persona lenses to express ourselves externally. So as long as we have a disconnection from that to a certain degree to where we can tell that, okay, this is more of a tool of expression than it is my actual deeper personality. It's not all there is to me. And so with this core personality, based on our experiences, based on our ability to really stretch our wings, we can become more and more individuated. The more we can bring aspects of ourself out into the external world and develop them that way. So what ends up happening whenever we're in situations where we can't really fully be ourselves and we can't really do what our core personality is intuitively trying to drive us toward, is that unfurling doesn't have room to happen. It's a little bit like if you were trying to, let's say, plant a garden, but then you had like all these like tarps covering certain aspects of the garden. It's just that the seed can't really sprout above the surface. It's not really getting what it needs to grow. And so what ends up happening is that a person ends up getting stuck in a position where certain growth can't happen. And so what happens is that growth stagnates in some aspects of the personality. So let's take, for example, for like, let's say my personal experiences with this. So I always, let's say, the part of myself that I'm orienting through now, the part of myself that's, let's say, interested in thinking deeply into things and that kind of thing, that aspect of myself, I didn't have an outlet to express that part of myself. And what ended up happening is that aspect of me was really stagnant, or like I ended up just kind of having to be by myself to just be this way, because I couldn't find an outlet to be able to express that where I could be understood. And because of that, I didn't get a chance to grow that aspect. But in creating my channel, essentially what I've been able to do is attract a lot of people to myself who are also kind of on the same wavelength, and to be able to really bring that aspect out into the world and to interact with other people. And then this aspect actually gets to grow. But if I didn't have the capacity to bring that out and to have it exist as a reality in the external world, it just kind of stays internal to me and kind of stays in a state of arrested development. And so basically what can happen with a person who decides, okay, I'm just going to stay in this context where I'm stagnating, where I can't grow, is that, either aspects of themselves just either stay or become repressed, or they just have to suppress certain aspects where they're aware of those aspects in themselves, unlike repression where they're just not aware at all. But suppression is basically like, oh, I know I have this aspect about myself, but this social environment that I'm in, this situation that I'm in, doesn't give me an opportunity to really stretch my wings in that way. And so, it just that we don't end up developing and individuating those aspects of the self.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So that was complicated, but that was wise. So I'm gonna see if I could break this down in the most beautiful analogy and the one that I understand the most. And have you ever seen the movie Star Wars? The first six Star Wars movies?
I'm so bad. I've only seen like a handful of Star Wars movies. Yeah, I
Disappointing.
know.
But anyway,
I know.
I'll explain to you the archetypes, and you'll actually really enjoy this. So it's the archetype of the undeveloped self, and I really love this. So I mean, you have through the first six movies, right? Through all the first six movies, the entire original movies, you see the progress of Anakin Skywalker into Darth Vader, right? And obviously everybody knows Darth Vader. So Anakin Skywalker grows up as the child hero. You know, he's killing, you know, he has a prophecy. He's going to take down the dark side, and he's going to be the one who restores the balance. You know, he's going to be amazing. Then he turns into Darth Vader, and he turns into him around like 18, right? And 18 is a great age, you know, 18, 20, because that's the point where most of us lose our soul. You know, most of the people who will say reject their hero's journey, they lose their soul. And the archetype that they chose for him, which obviously resonated with people, because we could say it resonated with people, you know, it was the archetype of greed, right? It was the archetype of security. You know, instead of choosing to fight on the X-Wings and fighting as this tiny little good guy against the giant bad guys, he just chose to join them. He just said, hey, listen, I'm going to join the bad side because they give me security. I get to have power. And there was a quote by Obi-Wan Kenobi where he says, he's more of a machine than man now, right? And by saying that, he's saying, hey, listen, this guy is more of a robot. This guy is more of a he's disconnected with his consciousness. He's chosen to, you know, focus on, we'll say like a robot mind or a greed mind instead of a, you know, a developed self. So he's the existence of a failed character. But then in the sixth movie, what happens is he actually fulfills the prophecy. He kills the Sith, right? He kills the biggest bad guy, and he restores the balance of the Force. He becomes a hero again. And what happens is, this is the best part, Luke Skywalker, his son, he says, or Darth Vader says, take off my mask, Luke, right? Take off my my machine, take off my greed, take off my you know, my persona that I've put off. You know, you can imagine that as like the garden metaphor, right? Imagine he has this entire garden, which is himself, and he's put a tarp on 90% of it, right? And he essentially says, take off my tarp, take off the mask that I've been wearing. And what you see, what is left is a crumply, bald, fetus looking, you know, really undeveloped person. And that is the idea of the undeveloped self. You imagine, you know, you take off the tarp, you take off the hero part of yourself, and what is left after 20 years of not pursuing it, you have regret. You have, you know, this hero self of yours, which is just completely undeveloped. So
absolutely. Yeah, no, that is a great archetypal symbol that reflects that. Yeah. So basically, yeah. And it can be often difficult to tell when we've put on that kind of like hero's mask, because it feels like, oh, we're doing something good for ourselves and everything.
Yeah.
And basically being able to be aware, kind of not even just in this one avenue of people, let's say, going into jobs that they don't necessarily resonate with. This can come up in many different sneaky ways, this kind of of the self, and to kind of keep ourselves safe. So let's say, like, what will be an example? So let's say that I develop a persona for myself. So let's just say that, okay, let's take my YouTube channel. So if I develop a persona for myself that's like, oh, I'm this person and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And, you know, it's something that I really enjoy. But let's say that I really make it into like a persona and I hyper identify with that persona. And it gives me a sense of security, and it gives me a sense of being able to, like, let's say, boost my ego a little bit. What can often happen is that because there's comfort to be had in that story, what I might fail to do is to recognize that this is my Darth Vader mask. This is my tarp. This has now been used as a tarp for me, and that there's still yet more of myself under that veneer of my persona that's being underdeveloped. And so this is how it can be tricky to be able to tell when we have those tarps on our personality. especially kind of even tying that into, let's say, our, that sort of unconscious religion that, each one of us has, that may not be super evident in the way that, let's say, we see somebody, let's say, again, following a religion that we don't ourselves subscribe to, certain things stand out like, oh, that's interesting, that's the worldview. And we can see their platform in that way. But we can't see the platform we stand on. And whenever there is, let's say, a worldview and let's say a persona and an ego structure that derives from that, we can have a very difficult time questioning our worldview. And so this is why it's very, very, let's say, important to become the line and to really question those things, because we may be wearing Darth Vader masks without even recognizing it.
So I find that I'm doing that all the time. The best question that I must ask is how can you get in touch with it? That's almost every hero story that I ever see ever. It's like, the hero goes on some path and then they realize that they are separated from the person that they were. Maybe they've developed and they become a lot better, but at the same time they've lost themselves in a little way. You could see that in Lion King, right? Like that's what Hakuna Matata is. It's like, oh yes, let's pursue all the pleasure in the world. And Simba's like, hey, listen, I'm having a great time. Why would I want to leave this? But of course it is bad, because of course it's not, he's avoiding his responsibility, and then he forgets who he is, So I gotta ask the question, how in our own lives can we sort of get in touch with instead of our ego, get in touch with our own unconscious thoughts?
Gotcha. So basically, one thing to look at is to look at our worldviews and our identity and to really question those things about ourselves. So, and especially if we find ourselves thinking, let's say, in inflated ways about ourselves, or deriving some comfort or personality from, or persona from our worldviews. So let me think about, let's say, a specific example. Well, I guess I'll just use personal examples again, because it just pops to mind. So let's say when I was about 16 years old, I had really developed the capacity to work hard. It was like when I developed my work ethic. And I remember as though at the time I had just started working. I worked at a fast food restaurant, and then, I went to high school, and, basically I would get up every morning really, really early, get on the bus, take like an hour long bus ride, get there, go through my day, get off, go to work, come home, do the dishes, do my homework, get like 4 hours of sleep, and just do it again and again and again. And so because of that experience and how intense it was, I had developed kind of a bit of a like, oh, I'm a hard worker. And this was part of my ego structure. And it was something that I also wanted other people to see about me. I wanted people to perceive of me as a hard worker. And so I was always like, kind of going through, and really I was able to develop a lot of skills from this, because when you really put yourself into things, there can be a lot of, let's say, beneficial things that people in society will smile upon. And this is where it becomes tricky, is that, oh, you think, oh, I'm doing this great thing, I'm on this hero's journey, I'm doing that, and then what happens is that when we become, like, let's say, when we start deriving our worth, when we start identifying with that, as opposed to using it as a tool in our tool belt, it's like, it's a little bit like, oh, I've got this nice hammer, now I can use this hammer. But then it's like, if we hyper identify with the hammer, everything then becomes the nail. And then we
Midas touch.
Absolutely. Then we lose the rest of our personality. And this is what happened to me between the ages of 16 and 20. And I just kept, like, sort of in a negative sense, cutting the floor out from under myself. I kept repressing more and more of myself, because my standards for myself became higher and higher. And so I really ended up in a space where I became so fragmented that essentially, I was really setting myself up for a breakdown. And in a sense, certain things did break down in my life. After 4 years, it wasn't sustainable. And I had ended up having my awakenings right at the end of that experience. And so I was able to kind of get back in touch with myself, but I was just losing so much of myself, and so much of myself was stagnating, turning into the shriveled up bald guy under the Darth Vader mask. And I wouldn't have been able to see it had I not experienced a very negative consequence. So it's something that I'm like very hyper aware of now, that if I develop a skill, or if I have something that I appreciate about myself, I understand it more as a tool in my tool belt, as opposed to some fundamental aspect of my personality, or something that makes me existentially valuable in some way. So that's kind of the way I would say it is. Like, if you notice that there's a certain quality that you have or a certain tool that you can use, being able to use that, but also not hyper identify with it.
Wow. That is, I don't even think I need to elaborate on that, because I think that was very, very well said. And yeah, no, that was wow. And then I got to ask the question, because this is something that, I get so interested in. So let me give you my personal story in this. I sort of did the same thing. I will say for about a year, for the last year, before probably like 3 months ago, I was hyper, we'll say productive, but also hyper repressive, and slept very little and wasn't able to do stuff like that. And man, like the amount of, we'll say, weight that it took down on me, that it pushed down on my shoulders, was so difficult. And while I got a lot of work done, while I was a great hard worker, and everybody knew that I was a hard worker, it was like, I'm using that persona a little bit too much. And then, then I started looking at Jung a little more. That was definitely a big part of it. And I think this is the craziest part. I said one day, I was like, you know what? I'm going to sleep 10 hours. I'm going to sleep 10 hours tonight. And I said, because I was so deprived on sleep, that was after a point I stayed up for, I think it was like 30 straight hours, and no more than that. And that's not even bragging. That's like, please don't do that. And so I did that. I slept 10 hours. I said, this is beautiful. I had some crazy dreams, right? And obviously, if you know Jung, then you know that I stayed up analyzing those dreams and trying to figure those out. And then I slept for 10 hours for the next 4 weeks every night. And then it was crazy. And then I went home and I slept for somewhere between 8 and 10 hours for the next 2 months. And it was incredible. The amount that I learned about myself. And yeah. Like the thing is, you realize that, throughout these times, you have different parts of your garden that have tarps on them, we could say. And well, let's say I've been repressing some part of my garden for a year now. It's like, you have to spend a lot of work to really catch that up to speed,
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, exactly. So I spend so much time trying to get back and, of course, keep developing, obviously you got to keep growing. And then I went to school here, and school happened. And literally in the first 2 weeks, I had early classes. I had to wake up early. I slept for like 6 hours a night for about like 4 days. And after 4 days, I started feeling some mild depressive symptoms right away. And I was like, I was sitting there trying to figure out like what's going on, what's going wrong. And I didn't realize that sleep itself is so important. I stopped dreaming. I stopped being happy. Like I started repressing all these parts of myself. I started trying to work more. And I realized, I was like, Nick, calm down, right? You're doing too much. You're kind of relaxing. And now obviously today I slept 10 hours, and I did have a point in this story. Well, so yes. My point of this is, as someone who's so into Jung, and as somebody who I'm assuming is very in touch with the unconscious, how have you been able to use dreams, and how have you been able to use sleep? Because, sleep is associated with almost every psychiatric disorder and every single cause of death, and also not understanding yourself. Carl Jung has analyzed over 80,000 dreams in his own life. How have you used dreams to help people? How do you, as a life coach, how do you help your clients analyze their dreams? And also, how useful are dreams?
Gotcha. So first off, dreams are really, really useful, because basically what's happening is that, okay, so you have the unconscious mind and you have the conscious mind. The unconscious mind is in a format that the conscious mind simply cannot understand. So the conscious mind works primarily in a narrative way, understands things through storytelling and through the happenings in, that are, that we notice, and being able to kind of put meaning onto them. We also can work in a kind of logical way. Whereas like the unconscious mind doesn't really work that way. It works in like basically a different format. So it's a little bit like, if you can imagine, like the unconscious mind is like a Photoshop, document. And then like, let's say you have the conscious mind, which is like a Microsoft Word document. They're just in two totally different formats. And so what you fundamentally need to have, let's say, communication happen between the conscious and the unconscious mind is you need some medium that the conscious mind can understand, that the unconscious mind can interact with as well. And so what we have is we have dreams. We also have synchronicities. We can also, let's say, use tarot cards or read mythology, these kind of things that have these kind of personal and collective symbols, and that our conscious mind can understand.
So let me ask you, most people will look at that and say, dreams are stupid, mythology is stupid, it's stories. How could you prove them wrong?
Gotcha. So in terms of proving people wrong, I would say it's something that you have to be a bit of a scientist with yourself and kind of do the process. I guess if I were going to try to rhetorically appeal to someone, I would just basically explain how it works. So basically, when it comes to, let's say, the unconscious mind and the conscious mind coming together, what you essentially need some kind of medium to understand the unconscious mind that the conscious mind can pick up on. And so it's a little bit like, if you can imagine, the unconscious mind is the invisible man. The way to understand the invisible man is you can throw a bucket of paint on him. And so fundamentally what dreams is that's the bucket of paint on top of the invisible man. That is the symbols that we can constellate onto the workings of the unconscious mind to understand them better. So dreams are something that the conscious mind can recognize and understand the symbols, and then take that and analyze. And so whenever we are, let's say, trying to do shadow work, or whenever we're trying to get in touch with what's underneath the surface of consciousness, one of the best places to look for that is in the dreams, because this is just basically let's say, probably, I don't know how many hours of storyline per night that we go through that happens to be coming on some level from the unconscious mind, things coming up, sort of projecting themselves as symbols that the conscious mind can understand. So I would say that it's one of those direct connections. So it's a little bit like, if you can imagine, it's like a collaborative space between the unconscious and the conscious mind, where there can be an actual communication happening there. And so we can use that and recognize aspects of ourselves or certain situations that might be playing out in the unconscious that we might not be consciously aware of. So I would say that it's very, very valuable in that sense. Now, the process that I use for dream work is something I learned actually in the dream work coaching course that I had mentioned. So it's put on by a guy named Will Sharon, and he has a YouTube channel himself. So maybe that's something, because I mentioned him, we can link below the video or something like that. But basically, the process that he had taught me about was that you start off, you have the dream, you write the dream in first person, and then you go through and you mark down, you try to split the dream basically into a beginning, a middle, and an end. So basically you would just kind of be like, let's say that I had a dream. I'll give you an example of a dream that I had. So I had a dream that I met this guy, and we were walking around downtown in St. Augustine, which is a very old town area. And we were walking down there. We were the only people down there, and we were planning on meeting back up later. And then I walk into this little pub, which is a very old-fashioned pub, looks like it's from the 1800s. And there's only me and the bartender and maybe one other person in the pub. And the bartender has 3 different glasses set up on this table. One is clear liquor, another is dark liquor, and then one is clear liquor, but that has a glow around it. And so I asked the bartender, oh, hang on a second, am I too early for the plan? So there was some kind of plan there. And it was understood that I was going to be drinking the clear liquor, and then there was going to be somebody was going to meet me, a guy was going to meet me and drink the dark liquor. And then I asked him what the third drink was.
The second drink, was it the same guy from the beginning that was going to meet you and drink the dark liquor?
That's something I don't recall. That's a big question mark for me. And so the dark liquor it was understood that there was going to be a guy that was going to meet me there in the bar, and that was part of the plan. And then there was the third drink, which was right in the middle of the other 2 drinks, and the one that was glowing. And I said, oh, what's that? And he was like, oh, that's called sacrael. And he said that sacrael has been put through an extensive purification process so that holy men can drink it, like priests and the Pope and stuff like that. And so basically I was wanting to start the process already. I was wanting to go through with the plan already. And, he said, no, it's too early. And so that's what I remember of that dream. So if I were going to go through my process with this dream, what I would do is the first step, I would say, okay, what's the beginning, what's the middle, and what is the end of the dream? And so the beginning is where I'm walking with the guy.
Was there anything special about this guy?
I met him, like I didn't know him from life. We were hanging out. It was me, my best friend Shanna, and a bunch of like teenagers, but me and Shanna were kind of teenagers too in the dream. And basically she had introduced me to the guy and we were talking. There was maybe a little bit of like a romantic kind of feel to it. Like I just met somebody, I'm interested in them. It kind of had that feel to it.
Okay.
So basically that was the situation with the guy. And we walked just a little ways and basically, and one thing that was interesting about the dream is that it was like, it happened to be Halloween and Christmas at the same time. Like, so it was like Halloween. Yeah.
Oh,
so it was both. Yeah. It was understood that, this is one of those years where Halloween and Christmas like fall on the same date. Like, and it was just like, okay, that's normal. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, so that's part of the dream too. But anyway, so let's say the first part. So if I'm going through beginning, middle, and end, the first part is I'm walking around with the guy. The second part is I walk into the bar and I start asking the bartender about like, okay, can we start the plan already? And then the end would be like, oh, what's the third drink? And he explains to me about like Sacrael. So that's kind of my arc of the dream. And then from there, I would basically find the core emotion that I was experiencing in each part of the dream. And so I would go, okay, the part where I'm in the beginning, when I'm walking around with the guy, what's the main emotion that I feel? And I would say that I would feel mild infatuation, so that would be like my first emotion. And then let's say I walk into the bar and I would say that I'm feeling, let's say, anticipation, like I want to get the show on the road. I'm like, anxious. And so anticipation. And at the end, when he is explaining to me about the Sacrael, I would say that there's sort of an intrigue. So my emotional arc of the dream would be, let's say, mild infatuation, and then anticipation and intrigue. And so that's my emotional arc. And so then what I would do after that is I would say, and sometimes this will be the case and sometimes it won't. Okay, has there been infatuation, anticipation, and intrigue that's popped up in my life recently? And so let's say I would be looking at my life and I would either say, okay, yes, there was this one situation that occurred, or no, it's not. So let's just take the example that it does track on with something in life. It's like, oh yeah, like I met this person and I kind of felt that way in relation to that situation. Mm-hmm. So there's that. So if I did that, so I can say that, okay, I can have just a general framework of understanding that this dream might pertain to that situation. And so what I would do after that is that then I would look at, let's say, anybody that I knew from life in the dream. So I mentioned that my best friend Shanna was in the dream. And so what I would do is I would say, okay, Shanna was in the dream in the first part of the dream. And I would say, okay, what are my personal associations with her? And so if I were to describe her personality in, let's say, a couple words, I would say she's very outgoing. She's very carefree. And like she really appreciates a lot of like, let's say loud things, so she kind of likes anything that's like, I'd say kind of just fun, kind of flashy a little bit. So those are like my associations with Shanna. And so basically with that understanding Shanna can be a symbol of something for me. So it's like, okay, maybe this is representing a part of myself that has that personality. And if Shanna's the one that introduced the guy to me, right? I can go like, okay, maybe this more like flashy Shanna-like aspect of myself is trying to show me some other aspect of myself. So I could think about, okay, maybe the guy is a representation of another part of myself. Like, oh, if I can be more in my, let's say, inner Shanna aspect, I can maybe meet this part of my personality and have this kind of, let's say, connection with this part of myself. And oftentimes infatuation with a character in a dream can have to do with wanting integration with a part of the self, particularly in this case, the animus.
Yeah. The male counterpart to the soul. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's say I have my personal symbols. So let's say that I look for any people or places that have shown up from life. So this is downtown St. Augustine. So my association with that is I lived real close to that when I was going to college. I don't live too close to it now. I'm still in St. Augustine. But then, it has this old town feel, and it just has a lot of like history there. And so there's kind of like, okay, maybe it's kind of hearkening back to certain past situations that involve that time period of my life. And so, yeah, I can look at these personal symbols, people, places, and objects that have shown up in life. So those are personal associations with people, places, and objects that I know. The next step is to look at, let's say, my associations with people, places, objects, situations that I don't know personally, but can recognize. So let's say that I look and I'm like, okay, what are my associations with bars? What are my associations with bartenders? What are my associations with clear liquor and dark liquor? What are my associations with Christmas and Halloween? What are my associations with this or that? And so I can look at that and I can kind of go through and say, okay, here's all of my associations, and just write kind of a list of whatever comes to mind. And then, basically being able to say, okay, if liquor shows up, like, what are my associations? Like, I don't drink too often. So there's not like a lot of like personal association, like, oh yeah, there was this time where I was drinking with this person. But if I did have something like that, I could go like, oh yeah, that reminds me of this situation. Or like, if it reminds me of a bar that I've been into or something like that, I could go, oh yeah, there's that situation. So there's that. And the next thing to do is to scan the dream for any archetypal symbols. So let's say if I take like the sacral, I think about that as more of an archetypal symbol because it is a representation of the holy man, of the priest, and so there are very specific archetypal let's say, meanings behind the archetype of the priest, so
it's the self.
Absolutely. And being sort of the transitionary point between God and humanity. And even like the Pope could drink it too. Like, so it had this kind of, very Roman Catholic kind of feel to the sacral. And so then there's that. So I would look at the different archetypal things. And then basically I would be able to take all of those things and kind of go symbol by symbol to try to figure out, okay, this kind of means this to me, or this kind of means this in general. And then through that sort of being able to derive a general overall message of the dream. So with this dream, I saw this and I was like, well, okay, if I'm going into the bar and we're going to be drinking some kind of intoxicant, so we're going to be going into some altered state, right?
Yeah.
There's this whole plan around it. And it's going to be me drinking the clear liquor, which, by the way, if I drink liquor, I only drink clear liquor. I never drink dark liquor. So I knew it was for me.
Really interesting.
Yeah. So basically there was clear liquor, and then the guy was going to meet me and drink the dark liquor. And then it stands to reason that there's going to be some kind of priest that comes in and drinks the sacral. And so to me, it was like, oh, there's a marriage ceremony.
Yeah. I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm like, okay, so there's this marriage ceremony that's going to happen. And so I could think about this in like the external sense or in the internal sense. So externally, it's kind of like maybe certain things are going to come together, sort of the lover's archetype. Things are going to come together as one that were previously separate. Or I can even think about this as sort of the feminine and the masculine aspects of my personality. I'm going to meet there, and there's going to be an integration with my masculine side. And this priest is going to officiate that, and it's going to be a representation of the sacred marriage. But the dream is also telling me that if I go into this bar, too early, that I'm not going to be able to have that ceremony happen. And it was the sense that I had kind of jumped the shark. I was in such a rush to have that inner communion happen that I was about to blow the cover. Like, it was almost like a lot of people were involved in setting this up, and it was like, because I showed up however long early, it was like, oh no, you're going to blow the cover. You're going to make it to where it doesn't happen. So being able to have patience comes through as a message in the dream, and to anticipate that there is going to be some sacred marriage that occurs if I am able to have that patience.
Wow. There were actually some other things that I got from the dream. I don't know if you'd be interested.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, you ready? So earlier in this conversation, you were telling me that in your life, and we didn't really go deeper into it, but I'm a good listener. You said that you are at the point in your life of confronting the dragon. Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that?
Gotcha. So it's like I'm in the process of basically exploring, let's say, deeper into, let's say, the things that I take for granted. So being able to explore the tension between needing to remain grounded and to have a context, because this is something that human beings do need, while also understanding that there's a kind of, let's say, assumption that I might be applying to reality that is, let's say, keeping me from the actual truth that I seek. So it's an understanding that I'm projecting, let's say, meaning onto reality, and that underneath that meaning, there's a deeper truth there. And so it really trying to slay the dragon in the sense of like helping the lion, the camel unburden the load that it's taken on, that it may not have even recognized that it's taken on.
So you're saying that in your life, so what you're saying right there is sort of the comfort of the things that you already know versus the danger of the things that you don't know, that you should integrate in your personality, but at the same time, it's difficult because you're pulling the floor out from under you. And you said that you were struggling, like you were in that point in your life, right? It's a very important point. When I heard this, I thought these are the 3 stages of the self, not in terms of the Nietzsche in that sense, but in terms of the Jung sense, right? The anima. So usually it goes the shadow, the anima, animus, and then the self, right? It seems like for you, you went from the animus to the shadow to the self, right? Because, the dark liquor seemed like it symbolized the shadow, right? And I really, really, when they said that the self, right, the self figure, the priest figure is not there yet, what they're literally telling you is right now you are in a fight with the dragon. Like that's literally what your own dream is telling you, because you haven't integrated the self yet, but you still must work on the shadow.
Absolutely. Oh, so that's very interesting. I never thought about it from that angle. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, so I just kind of, that's a good point. So basically interpreting things sometimes through personal symbols, if like we have the personal symbol down and we like forget the archetypal symbol. So even if we've labeled something as a personal symbol, it can still be an archetypal one. So I was kind of coming in with the assumption that, okay, well, if I'm going to drink any liquor, it's going to be clear liquor, and I don't drink dark liquor. So that's my personal association with that.
Yeah.
And so, but it's also because the dark liquor might represent, the shadow in and of itself. And I'm waiting for a certain aspect of my shadow to appear, maybe represented by the guy that I was walking with, or maybe some other man. I can't quite remember. But because of that personal association, I missed the potential archetypal symbol of the shadow. And so it's sort of like with this sacred marriage, like coming into play, I maybe missed an important detail of that. So that's something that's very important to keep in mind when doing that dream work process. Mm-hmm.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Yeah. I mean, I find in my own life, like I go through my dreams and I figure out at what point I am in my developmental stage. Like I'm like, all right, for in that case, like it's clear to me that like you are fighting your shadow, right? Like you are trying to figure out, how am I going to drink this dark drink, right? That's the question. And I find that in my own life, I had these crazy dreams, and let's see, the dream that I had a very recent dream that I don't know if it's relevant to this. Yeah, no, I don't think it's relevant. But I mean, I have dreams and I read them and I'm like, wow, this is like literally, this is exact. I find out exactly where I am in my life. And I also find out which parts of my garden, you could say, are not being analyzed or not being used in my own life, which is really awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's what I've found too. Like any time where I've actually taken the time to really focus on my dreams and to really look into them, it's always been very beneficial. And it's almost like when you directly engage with your dreams, it's almost like it's just they're more likely to stay up at the surface of consciousness. So I find if I get unfocused from my dreams, I'll start like not remembering them or feeling like, oh, what did I do last night? That kind of thing. But the more I pay attention to dreams in waking life, the more they'll come up. And the more that I engage with the symbols, it's almost like it'll be like, oh, here, she's listening. Here, give more.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I mean, I have a dream journal, and like I suggest that everybody keeps a dream journal by their bed, but it's so difficult. Like I'll be sitting there, I'll have like a beautiful dream, and then I'll be sitting there, I'm like, I need to write this in my dream journal, but then you're either too lazy because you're literally literally sleeping, or I'm just like, yeah, I would rather dream a little bit more. And then it's a problem, right? Because then you end up losing the dream. But I find that every time I do spend time looking at my dreams, I learn so much more about myself.
Absolutely. Most definitely. This reminds me actually a little bit. So something came clear to me from my dream last night, and it was just a little short snippet of a dream. It was a dream, and I think it was my husband and I. And I think we were supposed to be like maybe 10 years older than we are right now. And in the dream, he was making a ton of money, and I was making a ton of money. And you would think that this dream would be like a very like happy dream, like, oh yeah, awesome, we have all this money. But I was like dreading it. I'm like, oh my God, like we have way too much money, and like this spoiled, you know, like, and I'm just like going into this. And so it shows me that like there's kind of like this attitude toward abundance that like I have issues with, because I know that I have, let's say, derived meaning out of being somebody who struggled financially, and sort of that becoming part of my ego structure and my worldview that, oh, like I, you know, I'm not spoiled, and like I, you know, I've worked, and, you know, I've gotten to this point, and, you know, so there's a sort of like almost hero story that I'm like attached to. And so in the dream where I'm getting all this money and just have all this money, I'm like, oh no, like, and so that was an interesting thing that just came up in my dream last night. And it was only like, I can only remember a couple of scenes. So sometimes it can be just a really direct insight like that, where it's immediately clear. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of digging though, too. And what's always been surprising to me is you can really dig down deep into a dream that makes no sense at all. And you can be like, oh man, I can totally see what the dream is trying to convey.
Well, that's the thing. It's like, you know, I spend all my time looking at stories, right? I think mythology is literally the unconscious, and that's obviously something that Jung believed. And I'll watch a story. Like I've watched Batman, The Dark Knight, like 4 times in the last like 6 months, just to sit there and try to figure it out. And I haven't. And it's so frustrating. But that's the thing, you know, it's once you start uncovering like one little thing, once you start uncovering like one little piece of the dream, then everything starts to find. And it's the same thing with mythology. It's the same thing with, you know, Star Wars, Lion King, you know, and you just keep going through and you're like, wow, this dream was so much deeper than I expected. And the problem is you have to give the light of day, right? You have to sit there and be like, wow, this is something that is so, well, it has the potential to be meaningful, and I just have to find it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what is it specifically about The Dark Knight that's kind of like, let's say, kind of magnetized you to it to try to like pull apart the archetypal meaning? Was it just, oh, I want to find a movie to do that with? Or was it like, oh, there's something about this movie in particular that like.
So 2 things. First of all, I have spent my whole life understanding villains, right? I really, really understand the villains. Like I know the heroes could go pretty much any way, right? There's obviously like everybody knows what a hero is, but understanding a villain in my ideas is the most difficult thing. And I understand them. Like I see there's like the greed villain, like Darth Vader, then there's the power villain, like Scar, and then you have all these different types of villains. I cannot understand the Joker. Like the Joker makes no sense to me. I don't know if you've seen The Dark Knight, and like the Joker in that movie, he just makes absolutely no sense to me. And the other reason that I was going to do it is because I was sitting there. I said I loved the first movie in that trilogy, Batman Begins. Batman Begins, I thought was incredible. I watched The Dark Knight, and it didn't speak to me as much. It didn't speak to me as much as Batman Begins. And I wanted to figure out why everybody liked The Dark Knight so much more than they liked Batman Begins, and whether or not I was missing something. So
Gotcha. Go. So one thing is I think story-wise, objectively, Batman Begins is a better storyline, you know, and I've only seen it once, but I remember that I like this storyline better than the storyline in The Dark Knight. But The Dark Knight has the Joker. And I think the reason why the Joker is so intoxicating is because he's essentially an archetype of chaos. Yeah. He doesn't have a motive for anything that he does other than to be chaos, you know, and I think that that's why he's such an intoxicating, villain. And in a sense, he doesn't really represent a villain in that sense. So it's like, you know, you can't pin him down as a greed villain or like, you know, a power villain or anything like that, because it's really all about chaos. He could care less about those things in the same way that a force of nature could care less about its own agenda. It just happens, you know. So, and I think that this is what's so intoxicating is because we have Gotham City and let's say the police force of Gotham City that represents order. So there's a certain order of things, but there's corruption within the order of things, and then we have Batman, who is also in some ways an agent of chaos. He's an agent of chaos that is directing that chaos to help order and to, let's say, sort of remove the corruption from the order of Gotham City.
He's a creature in the night too, right? Which means he's doing things that are good for the police system, but he's also a creature of the night. He's prowling around, and even though he's stopping criminals, he's still mysterious and deep.
Absolutely. And also when it comes to, let's say, chaos and order, there's a sort of let's say interconnection between those two things, where if you have an overabundance of order, what happens is chaos has to come in there and kind of shake things loose a little bit. Or if you have an overabundance of chaos, what you have to do is you have to put order to it. And so Batman is basically like channeling chaos in such a way that it removes the corruption from the order that is Gotham City. And then what we have is we have the Joker. The Joker, he represents just pure chaos, pure, unchanneled, untamed chaos. And so he is, in a sense, very similar to Batman in that way. He occupies sort of the same shadowy place as Batman does, but he fundamentally is all about, causing chaos and wanting to recognize the chaos and sort of the lower nature of, like, let's say, all people. Mm-hmm. I think the reason why he is such an intoxicating character is because we live in a society that's ruled by an abundance of order, and a lot of the order that we live under is corrupt. And so in this way, we can see this agent of chaos, even if he's destructive, as being something refreshing, as being something that gets us in touch with a more animalistic part of ourselves, a more random part of ourselves, something that doesn't fall into all of these things. And so I think the Joker in that way, and especially the way he was acted by Heath Ledger, basically he just did such a good job at embodying just a chaotic person, and so I think that's what's really intoxicating about the Joker, the character, because if I look at The Dark Knight as a story, it's an okay story, but the Joker is just such an excellent character. And I remember I was 19 when that came out, and I went to go see it, I think twice in the movie theater, and I was like, really? Oh, this is just intoxicating. Yeah. So
it's interesting. So I always look at almost every movie that I see nowadays. It's almost every single one, and that says something. They're all symbols of the logos, right? They're all symbols of the structured order that we have created in our society. You can imagine it's sort of like a God image, right? Because obviously God gives structure, but you can imagine in also the sort of like New York City is logos, because it's just very orderly, and the thing about logos is it's very detached from the spiritual side. So like it's almost completely logic. And that's exactly what New York City is, right? So Gotham is essentially New York City, right? It's the New York City of the Batman world. And the thing that I like about it is usually when you look at something like a logos character, whenever you look at someone like a well put together logos, you always see that their flaw is that they hate spirituality. Their flaw is that they hate anything that doesn't follow a set structure and a set rules. And I really like how when you go into Gotham is a failed state. Gotham is a poorly run state. And what is their problem, right? Their problem is that they are so logos. They are so money-centered, right? They even said that in Batman Begins. He goes, in Batman Begins, the main villain, he says, we decided that we were going to infiltrate Gotham because it become corrupt. And Batman says, how did you do it? He goes, economics. And that was the idea, right? He's like, I'm going to do it by making you guys care so much about this stupid concept of money, and you guys are just going to fall apart because you're going to lose yourself. And that's the problem with Gotham. Gotham is so logos. They're so money focused, but they're also spiritually poor, right? Like they're a failed state. That's, I guess that's symbolism behind that. And the only thing that I don't understand is there's a story inside of there. There's a story inside of the movie where Alfred comes and he tells Batman, he says, he's discussing, he's like, this is the character that Heath Ledger's Joker is playing. He says, there was this man when I was back in, we were in a forest and we were creating the society, whatever. And the locals had all these rubies, and these rubies were very, very valuable, and we would trade and barter these rubies. Then we find that this one person was stealing all the rubies, and this guy is symbolism to the Joker, right? This guy is stealing all the rubies. And they said we spent all this time trying to find him, trying to figure out why he was taking the rubies. He was always successful. But then what happened was we found a ruby, and a little kid was playing with a ruby, the size of a tangerine. And we asked him, where'd you find the ruby? He goes, I found it from a guy, right? And they found us from the guy. And you must ask the question, why was he giving the rubies away to little children? And it's just because he wanted to give chaos. And then Batman asked him, he goes, how did you get rid of this Joker character? How did you get rid of this guy who's stealing the rubies? And he said, we burned down the forest. Right?
Talk about that part of the movie. Absolutely. It's like, we have to keep the order no matter what, even if it destroys nature, even if it destroys things.
Well, yeah. Well, actually, I took it a different way. I thought they meant, if you imagine Joker is tyrannizing the city, just like he's tyrannizing the forest, just like the guy was tyrannizing the forest, the answer is burn down Gotham.
Oh, okay. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. So it's like the guy was actually preemptively hoping that would be the response to him stealing the rubies. He just wanted to cause destruction, and he stole the rubies, that they would try to drive him out by, basically burning things down. And that mirrors on to what the Joker did later on in the movie, and it failed, but like he tried to make it where, the people on the ships would like blow each other up, because of, in response to him and his, chaos.
That's interesting. So they would destroy it from the inside. I like that. That's funny. I think that's why people sort of see him as a hero, right? So they see him as a hero, obviously, because they ended up making the Joker movie, but they also see him as sort of a villain. And I think they see him as a villain because he wants to tear down the structure of society and he's complete chaos, right? And obviously that's the way you're structured in the movie. But they also see him as a hero because he's fixing the corrupt state, right? Like you imagine there are so many things that were going wrong with this corrupt state, and well, the Joker is sort of fixing it, sort of getting rid of it. And you could think of that as the archetype that we were talking before, with the three metamorphoses and the camel lion child, right? What Joker is doing is, even though he's tearing down the system, he's tearing down the corrupt system, he's the one who's also fighting the dragon. And, that's sort of the idea of the Lion King. It's like, how does the Lion King end? The Lion King ends with Simba kills Scar. Do they establish a new system? Do they have, do they figure out something new? We have no idea how they treat the hyenas afterwards. We have no idea how they treat the shadowy side of the kingdom. We just know that he killed the shadowy side of his kingdom, right? He uprooted the corruption, which is fighting the dragon. In the case of Joker, right, it's the same idea. Joker just wants to get rid of the corruption, right? No matter how he's going to do it, he just wants to get rid of the corruption. And there's something heroic in that, because that's exactly the story of the Lion King. But yeah, I guess that's all. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So basically with the Joker character, he's kind of like, he does it indiscriminately. So he gets rid of the corruption by getting rid of everything. It's almost like just burn it all down. It's too much. It's a rotten apple, like let's get rid of it. Whereas Batman pinpoints and says, okay, this is the corrupt factor. This is the corrupt factor. And I think in this sense, I think there is an awareness that, like with, let's say, Gotham City representing corruption, that, society often runs in a corrupt way. And I think this is something that, human beings feel like, it's like, oh, there's just so much corruption in society. And it's fundamentally like, it's just like, sometimes you can get into a really fatalistic mindset, like, oh, there's just so much there, you could never get rid of all of it. And like, it becomes a lot of pressure. And so I think it's kind of sort of tension relieving to go like, oh, just burn it down. Of course, it's not a healthy thing to do. But I think that having that embodied in a fictional character, is like, it feels empowering, even if it is negative, even if it's, never want to have happen in real life. The fantasy of it is like imagining yourself to be a Joker kind of character, just burn everything down and we don't have to worry about that anymore.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. And I think, the biggest thing that I've seen, and, I'll go back to it, the biggest thing I've seen in all these movies is that everybody hates the logos, right? The society that we have created where we're so money focused, we're so greedy, right? I think somebody said it best. I was talking to my friend and he goes, the default in society is to be greedy. Right. And we think of like maybe excessive greed is like Wall Street or something like that. But I think everybody to some degree is pretty greedy in that we are looking as money as essentially our religion, as our object of affection. And it well, that is that the problem with that is we've forgotten our spirit, right? Like you spend so much time in the pursuit of money, sort of like the Midas touch idea, where you spend so much time in pursuit of gold, so much time in pursuit of wealth when Midas, everything that he touched turned into gold, then essentially one time he touched one of his loved ones and she also turned into gold. And,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most definitely. And I think this is sort of like where, kind of to bring it back to what I was mentioning about knowing the emotional motivation behind why you're doing what you're doing is really, really important. Because I think what ends up happening with people who, let's say, become wrapped up in greed is that they're essentially projecting more meaning onto money than is useful. So basically, and I was talking to a guy, I think I was about 20 or something. I was talking to this guy who was maybe in his 40s or 50s or something. And he had told me something that kind of stuck with me. And he was saying, money's value is that it's a means to an end, and beyond that end, that doesn't have any value anymore. And so basically, once you meet your needs and once you're able to have the financial freedom to do whatever it is that you want to do, at that point, like the efficacy of money as a means to an end runs out, but yet people still continue to want more and more and more. And so I think this speaks to other meanings that are sort of projected upon there. It's like, let's say a person's seeking money because they're trying to get away from feelings of insecurity. It's like, oh, I need more and more and more money because it's going to run out. And then if it runs out, then I'm going to end up, again, kind of like with the idea of being the beggar on the street, there's a fear there that might, let's say, happen there. Or somebody projects the meaning like, oh, in order to be a highly accomplished person, I have to have all of this money. And if I don't have that, then I'm not a highly accomplished person. If I'm not a highly accomplished person, then I'm not valuable. And so it's essentially this sense of, oh, I need to get more and more and more money because every time I do that, I feel a bit more valuable. And it's like it solidifies the stance that, okay, I'm not I'm not inferior in some way. My existence here is valid. So what happens is basically people's underlying assumptions about money end up leading into, let's say, negative orientations to it, where it becomes so much more than what it actually is, which is a tool, which is a means to an end. It's a way to basically purchase what you need and what you want. And then beyond that, it's serving some other need. So basically, I think a lot of what has to happen for us as a society to hammer out the greed problem is to recognize the things that we are projecting onto money, and then to be able to see through that projection and to understand what emotions are actually motivating us to do that, and to deal with those issues at their core. So if somebody fears insecurity and instability, recognizing that there may be some trauma, or some kind of understanding of how the world works that might be creating that. And so resolving that, as opposed to just trying to get more and more money because it's a temporarily, because of the meaning projected on it's a temporary relief. Or let's say that somebody is, trying to make themselves important, or, to feel valuable through, let's say, getting lots of money and to be really focused on that. What has to happen there is it's like, okay, what is it that I'm running away from? What is it that I'm afraid of? And being able to face with that and to sort of untie those things that are going on down in the shadow, as opposed to, again, kind of going into the more greedy behavior. So greed is a behavior that in its symptoms expresses in this really, let's say, negative way, in this really anti-social instead of a pro-social way. And so if we can see that on the surface and recognize that isn't, we would have a tendency to say, okay, greed, evil. But if we recognize that's a symbol, we can kind of, in the same way that the roots of like root vegetables are very different than the leaves that stick above the surface. So if, let's say we have a carrot and we have the carrot leaves poking above the surface with the carrot underneath the surface, the leaves are basically like the greed. We can recognize that as a symptom and we can go like, okay, what's actually underlying this greed? What's actually happening down here? What's actually motivating me emotionally? What are the certain beliefs that I have? And that's where I think shadow work, and consciousness work comes in handy quite a lot. Anything that helps us get more grounded and more aware that we are being motivated by these different emotional reasons of things that are going on that we may not be super conscious of. And I think the more people wake up to those aspects of ourselves, the more we're going to be able to have a healthy societal situation, as opposed to one where we're kind of expressing our shadow in these very, let's say, negative kind of ways, in disintegrated kind of ways.
That's really interesting. And you're saying the negative way that we express it is in greed.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. Wow. I think that's, okay. No, I think that's so interesting. I think we struggle a lot. I find that there's a lot of insecurity that comes into money. And I think that, obviously money is this, symbol of status. I think that's one of the biggest things, importance, like all these beautiful things that you could have in society. I think it's just so difficult to be able to, I guess, say that the problem is that when I say I want to get rich, right? If I say I want to get rich, I could solve like 5 problems in and of itself right there. I could solve the status problem. I could solve the feeling of being valued, the problem of course, gaining, being labeled higher in the hierarchy among men, and then also being more selective, being able to get women, right? Like those are, of course, super high. And it's obviously the same thing for women, just flipped. And there are probably like 5 or 10 more that you could probably gain out of that. Absolutely. If you want to do deep shadow work, it's like you got to hit every single one of those individually. And I think that's the biggest struggle.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and that's a great point, so recognizing, like, let's say if I notice myself engaging in, let's say, greedy behavior, figuring out what is it that I'm looking for? Why am I looking for that thing? And what is it that I'm trying to get away from? And why am I trying to get away from it? So let's say I'm like, okay, I want to get rich, right? And so I can say that, okay, like getting rich is basically the vehicle to bring me somewhere, right? It's trying to bring me somewhere emotional. Where is it trying to bring me? If I say I want to get rich, what I really mean is I want to be experiencing these emotions or to get away from those emotions. And so I could go like, okay, let's say I want to get rich because that's going to mean I'm going to be of higher social status. Let's say that I want to get rich because I think it would be exciting to be able to travel around as much as possible. I want to get rich because, it's, let's say, difficult to, deal with the instability and the uncertainty. So I want to get rid of the uncertainty. Or I want to get rich because, let's say, I think that it's going to lead into where I'm going to be, let's say, a better partner or something like this. I'm going to be a more attractive partner to somebody, So I have all these different reasons, so I can go like one by one. And so, like, let's say that if I want to go into getting rich because of high status, it's like, okay, well, why do I want high status? That's, again, another vehicle. So what emotion am I trying to get to, or what emotion am I trying to get away from? And so I can go like, oh, well, actually, in being high status, I feel like I can get away from feelings of being lesser in some way. I can get away from feelings that I'm not good enough. So that would be more of like a negative motivation. Or I could say that, oh, this vehicle is meant to bring me toward the exciting feeling of being able to have influence. Or I can have this like, new doors and opportunities are going to open up for me because I'm going to get to know people that I wouldn't otherwise get to know. And this is going to be exciting. It's going to be an adventure. And so there's different motivations there. And we can like basically, whenever we find motivations that, let's say run deeper. So let's say, okay, I want higher social status. And then I say, okay, I want higher social status because I want this type of man to be interested in me. Then I can go, okay, this is another vehicle. Why do I want this type of man to be interested in me? And then just keep following it down until I can get to the core emotion that I'm actually looking for. And sometimes it takes a few things. So it's, oh, I want to be rich. Oh, why do I want to be rich? Because it's a vehicle to bringing me to being high social status. Why do I want to have high social status? Status is because it's a vehicle for bringing me to attracting a partner that has these qualities. Why do I want to have a partner that has these qualities? Well, because I'm lonely and I want to get away from loneliness. So then I would hit, basically at that point, I've struck pay dirt. I've hit the bottom of it. Once you can hit the emotion, it can be helpful for being able to recognize why we're motivated in that direction in the first place.
Well, now you must ask, now I think you just gave the answer to the question of why is the focusing on the individual so important, right? Like we asked the question, it's like, as a person, right? Like, should I be focused on more on like the societal issues, like everything that's really going on around me? Or should I be focused on, like Michael Jackson said, like focusing on the man in the mirror, right? Like, that strong idea. And that's the mindset that I guess America has brought in for, years. And well, the answer is because you have so much to work on for yourself. You have no idea what is going on inside of yourself, and you have so much progress that you have to do. And but in doing that, then you will be able to, gain essentially, go on the paths that you want to choose. Now, I do have one question that I've been trying to work out, and this brings me to something that I guess is the most important thing, which is probably a good place to end it on, actually. So the best question that I've been wondering is, what is your purpose in life more generally? So I've started to figure out my purpose in life. If I were to peel back all the layers, right, in terms of, even like make a lot of money, form good relationships, have a lot of fame, like, like whatever, like here are all the things that I care about. I think that I've brought it down to the root in saying, I want to understand as much of myself as I possibly can, right? I want to die so that if we're going to talk about our gardens, right? I want my garden not only to have no tarps on them, but also to be grown, like fully grown. And I don't think there's anything else that I want. Like, I don't think, if I were to become famous and make all the money in the world and get all these things, I don't think it's going to do anything if I don't understand deep into myself. And obviously there are different personalities inside of me. Like there's the part of me that wants to become famous. There's a part of me that wants to make money. And of course, like there's a huge struggle between that. But my end goal that I really wanted to discover was going deeper into myself. Do you have that same idea, or what is yours?
So I would say the way that I think about my life purpose is like, so there's the internal thing, right? So I have that as like, like my personal, like internal orientation to myself. It's something that I feel like it's not like that. I would say it just tends to be where I am. I just happen to like, I almost do it habitually. So it's not so much what I have down as my life purpose. So basically my life purpose is something that I discovered in like a more concrete way. Last March, I had done an ayahuasca journey, an ayahuasca ceremony. Yeah.
We're going to have to talk about that. We definitely have to talk about that.
Yeah. So basically, so like what happened, just to kind of sum it up, because there's just so much. So first thing that happened is I started to die, and like I had to let myself die. And
in a vital sense, or in a physical sense, or in a mental sense?
I didn't know. I say it that way because I didn't know at the time. I'm like, oh, I'm dying right now. And so I just had to like let it go. And so basically I let myself die and my body fell apart. And then basically I ended up like merging with like the infinite that was like all loving and all knowing. And the death was kind of scary, but the infinite love was scarier. Like it was like there was something about it that was very unsettling.
What was it like?
It was, it's let me try to explain it. So basically it was a little bit like I was God and I was part of God at the same time. Like I was that thing. And what was happening is that there were all of these realities that I was making arise, and I would come to love and know them from every possible angle you could possibly love and know them from. And in an instant, an understanding of infinity. And then there was part of me as God that really was like, it would experience the suffering within those realities and want to get rid of those sufferings. And it would just be almost like a small child crying its eyes out. And so I would be that, and it would be like this, no. And then what would happen is I, as God, would wrap around myself as God and come to love it and know it. And from all of these different angles, and in an instant, I would make all these infinite connections. And it was like, it just kept happening. And I kept falling into, like, when God would wrap around itself / me, like, again, it's all mixed together. In that instance, it would, in any given reality, it would become the new reality that it would then come to love and know from all angles. And it just kept it kept expanding its level of knowing, because it had to be all knowing. It had to be this infinite thing. And then it would get to this sense of relief, like, oh, the suffering is gone. But then in the recognition that it was this infinite being, there was an anxiety that it would arise that, oh, like, it's always going to be this. There's never a way to get rid of suffering altogether.
The suffering, yeah.
And then it would respond in this very intense kind of way, like a very, again, like a small child that was like so vulnerable. And again, it would wrap around itself and like come to know it and love it at all these angles. And I kept, like, basically at this point, I, as God within the experience, like, I recognize that this is too much for me. I'm having a really hard time dealing with the infinite. And I had forgotten basically about Emerald. Like, Emerald was like, it was just like, it was almost like, it was this recognition that, oh, it had always, like, reality was the medicine, and now this was the medicine to take me up out of the medicine. And it was like, reality was just like dust in the wind at that point in time. And everything was like empty. And this is not a visual experience, by the way. This is not a sensory experience. It's just something that,
really,
yeah, it was emptiness.
Wow.
But like, basically at that point, I, as God, was having a hard time dealing with my infinite nature. And so God, in its mercy toward me as God, like, allowed me to go into the finite experience of being human. And so then I started to remember the details of Emerald again. And I started to come back into the room and to, like, anchor myself into things. And this is when I learned, like, what my life purpose was. It was, so God said that life purpose, like, in this, again, the ayahuasca ceremony, was to surrender to my humanity and to be the place of surrender for other people. So it's to be very, very human, and to be, like, almost orienting to my humanity in an innocent way, as though a child would, but also having had the awareness of these things, enabling me to straddle the borderline between the society and the infinite, let's say, so that I can actually have that knowingness that people can, like, come to me and I can help them, and to, again, be the place of surrender for them. So surrender to my humanity, be the place of surrender for other people. So that was something that really cleared up my life purpose for me, which I'd always kind of thought in a more surface level was, okay, I'm just going to, like, my life purpose is to teach people about these things. But it's really so much more about, reality as being a place that can be quite merciless, is to be an extension of the mercy to other people through living my life a particular way, and to help people in that sense. So
interesting.
It was really powerful, and so since then, which it's almost been a year now, since then I've been trying to live in alignment with that I discovered.
So you're saying, and I want to clarify this because this is something that I'm not sure about. So you're saying that your goal in life is not, so is it for others? So obviously to connect yourself with the divine, you could say, or to connect yourself with this God infinite aspect that we were talking about. Is your goal for other people, is it to bring other people closer to the infinite, to sort of be the bridge between them and the infinite? Or is it sort of to make them aware of the infinite, and so they could essentially be the same person that you are?
What was really clear to me at the time is that, like, it's a little bit like, if you can imagine, like, in a tribal setting, there's always, like, one medicine man or one high priestess or something like that. Mm-hmm. It was, like, really clear that I had been exposed to these things because I was supposed to play some kind of similar, like, societal role like that. It's because it straddles, like, the society and then the divine. And basically what became what came aware to me in the situation was the burden of the infinite, and so what I had always been struggling with before is like, is the purpose of my life to seek enlightenment, or is the purpose of my life to be very fully human? And like, how do those things interact and everything? And it was really clear to me that, oh, my purpose of life is actually to surrender to my humanity. And so it gave me like a really clear answer in that sense. But that the reason why I had been exposed to these different things, and the reason why I just had the nature that I'd been given, is because essentially, like, God's always seeking to extend mercy to intonations of itself. And since everything is an intonation of itself, it had like essentially picked me to do the job of being the place of mercy for other people. And so it put me in this space of recognizing that the reason why I've been exposed to the burden of that is that understanding that, basically you don't want it. Okay. So if somebody is, let's say, a weightlifter, right? So they're lifting like 400, 500 pound weights because it's the thing that they do every day. Like, they just really are into it that way. And the reason why I have been essentially very immersed in this kind of paradigm, in this kind of contemplation work, it became clear to me the reason why that is that I was building strength to be able to be like the bodybuilder that's lifting up 400 pounds. But it would be very, very unmerciful of me to take the 400-pound weight to hand it off to somebody who hasn't done that work, because what happens is that person can crumble under the weight. Yeah. And so the way I see it is that it's a very human thing. So it's like I, as a human, can kind of go like, okay, here's this human being. How do I meet them exactly where they're at and like push them over to just the next step? So it's never about bringing them up to the infinite or anything like that. That's a very specific path, and it's something that's very challenging. And like, basically, you have to go with where somebody's path is already leading them. So there's not a sense that this is the right way to go. Fundamentally, like, from the perspective of, like, again, merging with the infinite creator God, it's clear that every creation that it creates it does so for a reason. It wants to experience limitation. It wants to experience the finite. It wants to experience finiteness and particularity. And so essentially, to come from the state of being where this aspect of reality that creates all the rest of reality is infinite. And so if you can imagine the burdens of being infinite, it makes a lot of sense why it would want to, just like be able to live a finite experience where it doesn't know everything, where it, where there's a sense of a beginning and an end and an up and a down. And, so there's that element to where you don't want to shake people up out of that are, essentially living their purpose, which may not necessarily be something that, let's say, the way that we usually think about life purpose is, oh, what kind of thing am I going to provide for other people, and that kind of thing. And it happens to coincide with that. But a life purpose is not necessarily about that, from the perspective of the infinite. And again, this is just from what I've experienced. From the perspective of the infinite, everything is valid. Everything is valued by it and loved by it deeply. So it loved very much the experience of being emerald, and just in the same way that it would have loved the experience of being a duck, like it very much was not so much operating off of that, oh, the whole goal is to get back to the infinite, because it is the infinite and its whole goal is to experience the finite. So that's what I experienced in my ayahuasca journey. And basically what I've gleaned from that is that it's like, basically a wise thing for me to do to ground myself very much in my human experience and to help other people do the same thing, to help people establish roots and to be like, let's say, be in tune with their finite aspect, and then people who are meant to, let's say, be more connected with the infinite aspect, that as well. So it's a little bit like, I like to think about the journey as being a bit like a tree. So you have your roots that stretch a certain amount into the ground, and then you have the branches that stretch a certain amount into the sky or the heavens. So the up top is like the intellectual and the divine aspects of the self, and the roots are kind of like the more emotional and physical aspects of the self, the aspect of us that's earthly. So it's always my goal to meet people where they're at on the earthly level and to, again, make them a little bit more either dug into the ground if they need that, a little bit more grounded, or a little bit more, let's say, a little bit broader in terms of their spiritual development, depending on what that person's path really requires of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yes. Yes. That does make sense. Okay. Wow. That is,
Experience for sure.
yeah. Wow. Do you recommend it to other people or?
It's so my view on entheogens, because I've done 3 ayahuasca journeys before, 2 when I was 20 and 1 when I was 30. And basically every time it's been a very life-changing experience. The first 2 were just very, very easygoing experiences, but very profound at the same time. The recognition of God when I didn't, like, I was very much agnostic, leaning heavily atheist. It was like, oh, this is that thing, and the recognition that a lot of the viewpoints I was holding, the scaffolding that I was on was kind of rotten in a way. And, I have all these tarps over the garden. And what happened at that point, because I didn't have any awareness so much of spirituality. I'd always been very contemplative, but I always had kind of an allergy to religion or anything that seemed remotely religious. And so basically what had happened is after I had those experiences, I recognized, oh, there's so much wrong with the way that I'm seeing things. And what I tried to essentially do is I kind of kicked my crutches out from under me while I still needed them. And I really fell down in so many rabbit holes until I found, Gene Raffa's blog, and I went into studying some Jungian psychology, just as my own, on my own. And, it was, I think somebody could potentially have that experience and permanently end up down in a rabbit hole where they're really just stuck and they're not able to get out. And so I would say that if somebody's considering doing that, you have to, number one, just be very, very aware of the spiritual paradigm. And I would say you should probably have at least been doing a decade's worth of seeking. You should have never had, let's say, mental health issues that, let's say, might cause a person to kind of let's say, experience psychosis. So there's a lot of things that I would say are just contraindicated for that. But I would say that if somebody is coming at it from a perspective where they're kind of aware of what might be able to be experienced, and, that they have a certain ability to, let's say, to have a framework that's not going to completely crumble when they experience other things. What happened to me is I had this worldview and I just fully believed in it. And then what happened is my whole entire tower fell, my whole entire structure fell apart. And I basically was just in the rubble of my fallen tower and having to piece things back together bit by bit. So I would say, for the vast majority of people, I would not recommend, doing an ayahuasca ceremony. But I would say that there are cases, and for me, I know that if I hadn't done that back when I was 20, I would hate to see how my life would have gone. So I can't just be I can't be no, definitely don't do it. But I would just say that there are a lot of potential consequences there to, let's say, destabilizing one's tower before they're ready. I would say my recommendation is to do a lot more work on sort of taking apart that scaffolding first. Spend quite a while trying to slay the dragon first, maybe spend about a decade trying to slay the dragon before you try to do that. Yeah. So that's kind of my thought is I would say for the most part, I wouldn't recommend it just because of the possible ramifications in terms of the complete change in worldview that's possible. But for some people, it can be very transformative if that person has the ability to integrate that afterward. But one thing I do recommend, if somebody's going to do it in ceremony with somebody who's used to working with people on that level. So somebody who's a shaman or somebody who's, a facilitator who's worked with people and helping them integrate those experiences.
It's funny. I could feel the fight within you. I could feel the fight between, I don't want that burden on my soul, but also this was such an enlightening experience, right? Being able to,
it really is.
Yeah, go.
Yeah. And I hardly ever talk about it on my channel for that reason. And basically it's a little bit I don't I don't want people to like say like, oh, hey, she did ayahuasca, I'm going to try ayahuasca.
Yeah.
And then they end up in this like, you know, situation where they're like, what? Life doesn't like anymore, like I was. And so, you know, and I would hate for someone to get stuck down in that rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, it's tough. I mean, you know, there's all these, whenever I, obviously, you know, the idea of the belly of the whale, right? You know, there's this idea of the belly of the whale in almost every archetypal story where they say, you know, you're at one point you're stuck in a whale, and you could see this in Nemo, for example, right? Like, Marlin is holding on to the whale and he's about to fall into his stomach, aka either be swallowed or either be pushed out through the blowhole of the whale and go back on his journey and learn something about himself and do all these amazing things. And if you were to think of your spirit as a whale, you know, then you could say there are two things that could either happen from this. I could learn so much about myself, you know, and go on this crazy journey, you know, like in the belly of the whale. That's where Marlin finally lets go of his we'll say, you know, emotional problems with his wife dying and, you know, being too sheltering of Nemo and all these things. But at the same time, he could have died, right? And, you know, you could get swallowed by the whale, and it's so difficult to toe the line. But it's like it's the craziest part, that the point that you are going to learn the most about yourself is the point where you're in the most mortal danger.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And it's something that I know that for myself, it's like I'm willing to take on that risk because I feel like, okay, I feel like now I've experienced enough that I'm suited for that journey. But I definitely would say that it would be a little bit like so with Marlin, he had to go through that. It would be kind of like somebody who hasn't done the work. It would be kind of like somebody who, I don't know, just Nemo trying to go on that journey by himself or something like that. You know, so it's just sort of like, I'm just always very cautious about like, you know, because I know that like there's a lot of people who are, you know, big advocates of entheogenic use, and they're like, oh yeah, you got to try this or you got to do that. I'm like, hang on a second, wait, hang on. These are very serious plant medicines, you know, and there's has experience that could totally, again, shift a person's perspective and sort of leave them like, oh, how do I deal with life? How do I orient back to being an individual?
Yeah, well, that's the problem that everybody had with hippies back in the 60s and the 70s. You know, you'd say, hey, listen, these hippies aren't useful, right? These hippies aren't doing anything. And it's like, some of the hippies probably were not. Some of the hippies probably were very not useful and probably sunk into deeper depths in themselves and probably had the most miserable experience of all.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But like you listen to John Lennon's Imagine. And I was listening to it the other day, and I remember when I was like 15, 16 listening to that, I'm like, that is some communist socialist BS that like I'm gonna think it's complete BS. Like, this doesn't make sense. Imagine no possessions, imagine blah blah blah, and no countries, you know, like all these things. And then I listened to it again very recently, and I was like, wait, no, this has nothing to do with communism. This has nothing to do with like how we should structure our government. It's like, this is how you should structure your soul. It's like, you know, if you structure your soul that way, like, you know, you're not possessive. And, you know, by the idea of no countries, he's really saying, don't block off the pieces of your garden, right? Have all your garden be unified. And when I heard that, I was like, oh my God, you know, like he's on a different plane. He's seeing the infinite in a way that, you know, most people haven't.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. You know, and I think, you know, with that song in particular, I could totally see how somebody would, let's say, put the meanings of more of like the social, like, you know, onto it, because he is talking about those things, but I think he is using more of like a metaphor for what's going on internally.
Yeah. And I mean, you definitely could take those literally, and obviously, like, I don't suggest you use that in a governmental standpoint. Like, I really don't. But at the same time, it's like there's so much. You know, I don't hear music like that nowadays. Every time I hear music, I always hear like, you know, I like to think of ourselves, you know, I think one of the biggest things that I heard growing up, and I think every kid hears growing up, I don't know if you've heard it because obviously this is a bit later, but everybody says, you know, ogres have layers, onions have layers, right? There's that huge reference, and I absolutely love it. And I think of, you know, like that idea that we have layers is so strong, and, you know, getting to the core of the layers is the most important thing that you could possibly do. And I think every single piece of music that I've listened to over the last, and I've been really trying, and I've found some that are deeper. I have a playlist in my Spotify playlist called The Deepest Core. Like, it's literally called that. But most of the music that I listen to nowadays is the stuff on the outside. And
Gotcha.
but something like the Beatles is something that, it really opens up a different part of you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love the Beatles. Yeah. And I find that music in particular is something that you can really get into a particular aspect of yourself using music as sort of the vehicle for that.
I'm sorry, my laptop's about to die, but
I have to go in just a minute anyway. So
yeah, no, this was a very, very great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. I think I would say this is the podcast where I've learned the most about myself, and I hope the people who are listening.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that. Awesome.
No, I love this. And I think from now on, like, the people that I have on my podcast are going to be Jung people, because you guys are so interesting. You guys are such, you have such a different look at the world than everybody. So,
a very interesting paradigm for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So Emerald, thank you for coming on. This was really, really awesome.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. Thank you for having me on. I very much enjoyed the conversation.